Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. A cow chews its food, and then the food comes back up again, and it chews it again. It chews it again. It's called chewing its cud. It takes in everything, but then the second time around releases things that it shouldn't be taking in. Likewise, man must learn to discard that which wisdom would reject. To do this, of course, one needs to understand what wisdom is and how to come into touch with wisdom, how to understand the nature of wisdom. Men often talk about meditating and becoming conscious through meditating. Yet they spend their 15 or 20 or 30 minutes or an hour meditating, and then they go back in the world and do what they were always doing. They don't change. True meditation is an alteration from animal consciousness into higher consciousness, wisdom consciousness. And what is wisdom, and how do you get wisdom consciousness? Allah has 99 names and 3,000 gracious qualities. And we are familiar with these 99 names. We have been told what they are, and we have had the qualities of those 99 names described to us. If we can act with the qualities as described in those 99 names, we are acting with wisdom. If we can learn to absorb those qualities within us and then display those qualities in our being and in our interaction with humanity and everyone in this world, we are displaying wisdom. As we absorb these godly qualities, as we absorb God's names into our being, we notice that they are incompatible with certain types of behavior. They're incompatible with certain types of actions. You can't be merciful and angry. You can't be compassionate and arrogant. So we understand that upon absorbing mercy and giving out mercy, upon absorbing compassion and giving out compassion, absorbing justice and giving out justice, we go through an alteration. And this alteration is a change as to who we are. And one of the things that happens if we seriously take in these qualities and seriously act these qualities, then we throw out from ourselves all of the things that are not contained within these qualities. Now, we need to understand the nature of God to the extent that we can. We need to understand the nature of Allah to the extent that we can. God is a power, and he is a purity. And within this purity, he has no castes, he has no religions, he has no differences, he has no animosities, he has no enemies. He is a holy power that is made up of the qualities of his names, made up of the gracious nature of those names. And for us to be able to absorb those gracious natures is the ultimate that we can do, because that is who we are supposed to become. That is the truth of what man is. But man has a mind that separates him from these qualities. That mind is the egocentric self, the arrogant self, the self that has differences. To understand that and to be able to rid ourselves of those mind differences is a very, very difficult thing to do. And this is the process of becoming true man, to be rid of the influence of the lower self and the mind, which is part of the lower self, and enter into higher consciousness. The mind is constantly raising questions. The mind is constantly posing inquiries as to existence and is constantly doubting. Also, the mind is constantly creating a sort of magic, because the mind can take you from here around the world in an instant. The mind can create all kinds of different hallucinations within it. And for the moment that they travel through your mind, they seem real. So we need to detach ourselves from the magic that the mind creates, and we need to detach ourselves from the doubt that the mind creates. We need to detach ourselves from the differences that the mind creates. God sent into this world 124,000 prophets. And the prophets all came to teach man that there is a unity among all of existence, that God created all of us, and that God is within all of us, and that God resonates within all of us. We have this cage that is the body, but inside the cage is a ray that was sent to us, given to us, created within us by God. And this was the act of creation. The ray came from God, and God formed man around that ray. And that ray is known as the soul. And there is a unity amongst all mankind. And the prophets came to reiterate, establish, make known to man about that unity. But what man did as soon as the prophets left was, instead of adhering to the words of the prophets and the unity that was preached by the prophets, what they began to do is say, I'm different than you. My blood is different than your blood. My prophet is different than your prophet. And because of that, there is a separation between us. And because of that, difficulties arise between people. Status and power and caste and wealth, and separate people and separate them from each other. Also, within creation, when creation happened, the elements were brought into being to create the cage that houses the soul. And these elements have a certain arrogance within each of them, and a certain animosity within each of them. There is an animosity between fire and water. There is an animosity between air and water and earth and ether. They don't get along. They are in conflict. Now, Allah made them enter into a cooperative agreement to create this body. So for a period of time, they are in cooperation. But that cooperation ends after a period of time, and the body begins to dissipate. The body begins to fall apart because of the fact that these elemental forces within us are in conflict. Air is in conflict with fire. Fire is in conflict with water. Earth is in conflict with water, etc. There's a constant conflict. But we need to understand that within us, there is also a soul. And this soul is the truth of who we are. And we need to reflect upon ourselves so that we understand who we truly are. In order to be able to do this, we need to understand that God has no color. He has no differences. He goes into every heart. He has a tenderness and a love to him that is overwhelming and without condition. And we should also understand that the key to this existence, the word that is the key to understanding the nature of reality, is love. And Allah has given us this word to understand. And it is this unconditional love, this overwhelming, effulgent love that runs the entire galaxy and universes. It is this love that runs the 18,000 universes. It is through this love that everything stays in existence. It is through this love, through this divine love, that we are who we truly are. And we should be able to share this love with everyone that we see and we encounter. Imagine the grace and the blessing of running into somebody and having an experience with them where love is shared easily and equally. Imagine a large group of people like we have on this Zoom coming together and looking at each other's faces and seeing each other with love and with kindness, without animosity and without differences. If you look at our group, we have people from all over the world, people from every imaginable race, and people born into many different religions. But when we're together, there is a unity here that can only occur through the belief in God and the belief in his qualities and in his names. And in that understanding, we come to know truth. It is through love that we come to know truth. It is through overwhelming divine love that we begin to understand reality. Through divine love, we begin to understand wisdom. Through the lack of separation, we understand wisdom. Wisdom is acting with God's qualities as opposed to acting with the qualities of illusion. Look at the world right now and look at all the difficulties that are going on in the world right now. The most recent being Russia and the Ukraine. But before that, just recently, and still going on, there's a war in Syria. There's a war in Libya. There's difficulties between the Palestinians and the Israelis. There's difficulties in Yemen. There's the differences between the Shia and the Sunni. There are all kinds of differences and animosities that are running through the world. And these differences and animosities lead to death and destruction. And why is that? Because people are lacking love. People are lacking a true understanding that all power belongs to God, that all power comes from God, and that all sustenance and maintenance of this creation comes from God. And without that, nothing would be in existence. Yet man acts as if man controls the world. Man acts as if man's decision decides what happens in this world. There's a story about the prophet Solomon, which illustrates this point and shows you that even a prophet can have a misunderstanding about man's power and God's power. God gave to Solomon enormous wealth and enormous power. He also gave him the ability to talk to jinns and to talk to fairies. And with his wealth, he accumulated mountains upon mountains of food and goods. And one day it came to him to go to God and to say to God, God, I would like to feed all of your creations for a month. And God answered back, only I can feed my creation, and it is impossible for you to do this. And Adam said, and Solomon said, well, how about for 2 weeks? And God responded in the same way. And then Solomon responded to a week. Finally, it came down to a day. And instead of all of the animals in the world, it came down to just feeding the fish in the ocean. And so Solomon was given the edict by Allah that he could feed all the fish in the ocean for a day. And he gathered all of the jinns and all of the fairies and all of the people in his kingdom, and they pushed mountains of food towards the edge of the ocean. And then Solomon proclaimed, today Allah has allowed me to feed all the fish in the ocean. So come forward, we are going to supply you with food. And they began to push the food into the water. And one fish rose out of the water and opens its mouth. And its mouth was so big that everything that they pushed into the water, it took. And as much as they put in, it absorbed. And they couldn't keep up with it. And because of its voracious appetite, not only did it take in all the food, it took in the people and the jinns and the fairies that were pushing the food also. Everything it absorbed. So people began to run away, and Solomon became frightened. And Solomon then said to God, I understand what you've been telling me now. Only you can supply the needs of your creation. Only you can feed your creation. It was arrogant of me to assume that I could do this even for an instant. And God said, well, you understand now. And I'm going to send Gabriel with a drop of my grace, and that drop will satisfy this fish. Now, Solomon also was able to speak to the animals, and he was curious about this fish. And so he asked, he said, are you the biggest fish in all of the ocean? And he said, no, I have 70,000 brothers and sisters, and I am the youngest, and each one of them is 70,000 times larger than I am. And my mother is 70,000 times larger than any of us, and my father is 70,000 times larger than my mother. But Allah provides for all of us, and we are all taken care of through his grace. One time in about 1978 or so, Bawa came to visit with an entourage where I was living, and they came to my house. And my wife had prepared lunch for everybody there, and it was lunchtime. And Bawa was sitting in a chair in the house, and I was sitting next to him. And he said, have you prepared lunch? And I said, yes. And he said, do you have enough for 20 people? And I said, yes. And then he said, do you have enough for 40 people? And I said, yes. And he said, do you have enough for 60 people? And I said, yes. And then it struck me. What he was trying to make me understand was that we are not the ones who provide. God provides. And I said to him, Inshallah, Allah will provide for our guests, because it is all in his hands and it is in his grace. And I remembered the Solomon story while this was going on, and I reiterated to Bawa, your questioning as to how many people we could feed reminded me of the Solomon story and brought my focus back into reality, as opposed to thinking that we could do things. We have to constantly keep this at the forefront of our understanding, that God, Allah, is doing everything, and that we are assisting and helping if we have absorbed his qualities and are able to give forth the kind of love that comes from him, the kind of true love that true man can have if he enters into that state of divinity and loses his attachment to the meanderings of the mind and the vagaries of the mind and the hallucinations of the mind and the magic way of thinking of the mind and the arrogance of the mind. There's a story about a man whose name was Hallaj, and many of you may have heard of him. Hallaj was a Sufi, 12th, 13th century, and he said, Anal Haq. He proclaimed, I am reality. He established and made known that he was part of divinity. And this was considered heretical at the time. And he was sent to court. He was found guilty, and he was sentenced to be hanged. And he was put in a dungeon awaiting the time for his execution. And there was this would-be disciple of his who had heard about him and had wanted to learn about what it was like to be magnanimous, what it was like to be incredibly charitable in difficult situations. And he went to look for Halaj in order to get this information. And he found Halaj in jail. And disciples of Halaj had brought him all kinds of food, and he had distributed it to the other people in the jail, and all he had to eat was a piece of bread that he had soaked in water. And he asked him about what is it like to be truly charitable from the deepest part of your being to even your enemies. And Halaj said, come back tomorrow. And so he came back the next day, and by then Halaj was hanging from the gallows, and he was extremely disappointed because he didn't get the answer to his question. But that night he had a dream, and in the dream there was Halaj, and there was the judge who had found Halaj guilty of heresy and had sentenced him to death. And Halaj was pleading with Allah by way of the prophet to allow the judge to enter heaven with him. The man who found him guilty and sentenced him to death to enter heaven with him. Because he said, it was this judge that allowed me to become a martyr and allowed me to find my way to heaven. And so if he goes to hell, I want to go to hell with him. And if I go to heaven, I want him to come to heaven with me. And Allah listened to the plea of Halaj and allowed the judge to enter into heaven with the judge. And when they got to the threshold of entrance into that reality, Halaj waved the judge to go in front of him, and he followed the judge into reality. This was the nature of Halaj. He had no animosity. He had no differences. He could forgive the man who sent him to his gallows and to send him to death. He could forgive that man. Now, for all of us, we have animosities in this world. And these animosities come up at different times and for different reasons. How big is our ability to forgive? How big is our ability to love? How big is our ability to have unconditional love and to see another point of view? Halaj understood that what the judge was doing was enforcing the Shariat. And the Shariat, under those circumstances, was appropriate for the judge to enforce. And he had violated the Shariat. Bawa spoke about Halaj and said he'd have been better off to keep some of his knowledge to himself as opposed to spreading it out in the public. Because when you say certain things in public, depending on the political circumstances at the time, they can get you in trouble. They can even get you hung. And that's what happened to Halaj. However, if we learn to give love and to bring love into the world, then we can begin to break through the mountain of the mind that separates us from reality. Our egocentric self is what keeps us from becoming true man. True man has lost his egocentric self. True man has lost his attachment to his own power, his own wealth, his own fame, his own needs, and his own inclinations. He's given them up for Allah's qualities. And this is the work that we need to do. In order to enter into reality, we have to leave illusion. Now, what is illusion? What is illusion made out of? What is lust? What is anger? What is hastiness? What is murder? What is theft? What is fame? What are titles? What are all these things? Why do we think we need them? Why do we think we want them? What is it that attracts us to them and makes us slaves to them? And can we give up our attachment to all those things for mercy and compassion and justice and truth and love? Can we understand that all of the things that we consider absolutely necessary in this world are unnecessary in the next world? And do we realize that through unconditional love, we can change this world into the next world? We can change this dunya into paradise if we can walk with unconditional love. We will lose our fear. We will lose our anxiety because of our attachment to our Lord. Our Lord has proclaimed that he will be there for us in every instant if we desire him. But instead of desiring our Lord, we desire so many other things in this world. And those things become what is important to us and what we strive for. We desire fame, we desire wealth, we desire houses, we desire cars, we desire much more than we actually need. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't have a house. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't have a car, but this can't be the core of what your existence is about. This can't be the core of why we are alive. These are the things that we need to make our way through this world. But we have to understand that that's what we're doing. We're making our way through this world. We're not setting up a permanent residency here, because there is no permanent residency here. No one has made this world their permanent residence. No one has lived here over a certain number of years without the body dissipating, without them disappearing, and without them going on. And the question is, where did they go on to? And the question for us is, where do we want to go on to? Do we want to go on into God's kingdom, or do we want to repeat living in this world, in this dunya? And our actions will determine which it is that we choose. It can't be by saying, I want to go to God's kingdom. That's not enough. You have to actually act out that intention. So first, we have to set up the intention. We have to get rid of the questions in the mind. We have to get rid of the magic in the mind. And we have to replace the meanderings and the hallucinations of the mind with Allah's qualities in our being. And when we do that, then we can move into the light, because that is what will take us into the light. Everything from this world of illusion will hold us in place in this world. And that's the reason for reincarnation, because we haven't given up the attachments. And when the attachments are given up and replaced with God's qualities, then we can move in God's way. And where is God's way? Towards his kingdom. And what is his kingdom? His kingdom is the kingdom of light. And the kingdom of light doesn't need the form of this world. So we are either in love with form, or we learn to love qualities. Love has no shape. Compassion has no form. Mercy has no form. You can't weigh these things. You can't measure them. You can't buy them. But they are more real than anything you can weigh or can buy or can barter. And we have to learn to integrate formlessness through this cage of our body into that formless part of us, which is our soul, which exists within our heart, where God also resides in each one of us. And we need to make a union with that. And when that union occurs, we will understand what wisdom is. We will understand how wisdom acts, and we will understand what's right and wrong. And we will be able to discern our soul. We'll be able to know who we are and the truth of ourselves. And this illusion of a body will no longer hold us in place and chain us to this world. We will be set free so that we can join truth, and we can join God, and we can join reality. Hak will become our home. Hakikat will be our way. Truth will be our touchstone, and we will know truth, and we will know reality. May reality be opened up for each of us. May reality be brought into our purview so that we see it and we feel it, and it overwhelms us to such a degree that we lose our attachment to this dunya, to this illusory world, and we concentrate and become fixated upon and become attached to our Lord, and that becomes the purpose of our existence. May it be so for each of us. Ameen, ameen. Ya Rabbil Alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.